So we can summarize what sorts of factors can lead to the evolution of greater size and greater complexity among organisms. So for example, we've got biofilms. So biofilms result from adherence to solid surfaces, but because these are multi-celled, because the biofilms are made up of multi-celled microcolonies, the biofilm cells are able to thrust themselves out into resources and thereby have greater access to the nutrients and oxygen that's flowing past them, and also are able to resist being shaded by other microcolonies that could be growing adjacent to them. Now, this process is successful because the cells that are involved tend to be clonal and tend to therefore be able to cooperate among one another. Nonetheless, biofilms are colonial rather than truly multicellular, and therefore display relatively little sophistication. But they're certainly larger as a group of organisms, a group of cells, than a single cell is. Selection for larger size can come about because the phagocytic lifestyle requires that an organism be able to take another organism, or at least chunks of food, inside of their cells. Presumably, as a cell becomes larger, it is able to engulf larger prey, and therefore the taking on a phagocytic lifestyle as a means of acquiring nutrients can lead to the evolution of greater size, especially in terms of individual cells. Engulfing also selects for increase in size, or at least can select for increase in size among other organisms, particularly those organisms that can be subject to being engulfed, the potential prey organisms. There is also the potential to not just increase in size in terms of individual cells, but for cells to band together as a means of increasing the aggregate size and thereby resist engulfment. Planktonic as well as benthic colonial organisms therefore can evolve as alternative to large cells for avoiding engulfment. Planktonic basically means floating around, and benthic basically means adhering to a surface, such as the bottom of a water column. And what having multiple cells instead of having just one big cell can solve is the surface to volume issues, where each of the individual cells can represent its own surface to volume ratio, and which as a consequence of being a subset of the total number of cells can be smaller than the surface to volume ratio of the aggregate itself. However, as noted, this can lead to problems whereby individuals are more susceptible to attack by, for example, viruses. In the case of larger cells, it's because simply the larger cell has more surface area that the virus can encounter and absorb to. In the case of colonial organisms, the problem is one of one cell becoming infected and then the progeny from that cell being released and infecting the rest of the cells associated with the colonial organism. Greater size may allow for a minimization of the sharing of extracellular digestive enzymes. So if you are large in size and you're still secreting digestive enzymes outside of your body, at least if you're big, the volume that can be taken up by other cells in your vicinity may be taken up by your own cells, and as a consequence, the cells can take advantage, the cells making up your body can take advantage of the release of the digestive products that are generated by these digestive enzymes. We take this to an extreme when we actually surround our digestive enzymes, and this is done in the case of ingestion, with animals taking food particles and other organisms into their own bodies and digesting that food extracellularly, and then the only cells that benefit are the cells that basically make up the animal, that are surrounding this volume, our gastrointestinal region that performs the actual digestion, where the actual breakdown of the food stuff outside of our cells occurs. But you can see this on a smaller scale if you've got a larger organism that has associated itself with a surface and is relatively large, and thus when it releases digestive enzymes against that surface, most of the digestive products can find their way back to the cells of this organism that is surrounding, but not completely, the substrate upon which it's feeding. Thus, we can have digesting of materials found on surfaces by, for example, fungus-like creatures. Fungi in particular, they tend to live in relatively dry environments, so their digestive enzymes that they're secreting are not able to diffuse very far away from the organism. So again, the fungus and the many cells that can make up a hyphae can, or at least the large body size in the case of cenocytic hyphae, can benefit the most from the production of the digestive products that result from the action of the fungus's own extracellular digestive enzymes. Ingestion requires large size in order to take another organism or parts of that organism into the body of another organism. And this is something that allows for a digestion of free-floating materials or free-floating organisms, that is, as opposed to materials that are found associated with surfaces. You can get away with adhering to a surface and excreting digestive enzymes onto the surface and then consuming the products of that digestion, if indeed the material is found on a surface. But if it's not found on the surface, it's helpful to be able to take those materials and place them closely up against one's body, and the most effective way to do that is actually to bring those materials into one's body in the process of ingestion. Ingestion by animal-like creatures also selects for an increase in size among potential prey. If an organism ingests prey, they can only ingest that they can take inside of their bodies. If there are larger things out there, they're not going to be consumable unless, of course, the ingesting organism invents claws and teeth and other things to rip the larger organisms to shreds, which of course they did, and the larger organisms responded by evolving armor, etc., etc. But anyway, these are all things that can lead, at least in the short term, to the evolution of an increase in size of organisms. Colonial living also represents a means of potentially keeping cooperating related cells within the same volume, well, space volume. It is really the solution that we came to when we were talking about the evolution of cooperation among microorganisms. Holding all of the cooperating cells, the colonially related cells, together in the same volume and excluding non-colonial related cells or cheater cells from that volume is a way in which cooperation can be stabilized. And the same solution is reached with multicellular organisms. It's just that the cells are not necessarily free-floating within that volume, but instead are associated with one another, adhered to one another. There also can be antiviral protection that can come from living as a group of cells. For example, it's possible for an infected cell to essentially commit suicide, thereby killing the virus that's infecting it at the same time. And if this is protecting closely associated clonally related cells, then the clone as a whole gains from this. It's a case of inclusive fitness or kin selection, where the sacrifice of one is made for the good of the larger number, in this case of closer related individuals. You see this inside of our own bodies, where we have cytotoxic T cells and also cell-mediated cellular cytotoxicity as mediated by by natural killer cells. You also see it inside our own bodies, where virally infected cells are sacrificed in order to get rid of the viral infection. And you also see this kind of thing in bacteria, where so-called abortive infection systems, a bacteriophage that infects the bacterium, can be eliminated through the death of the infected bacterial cell. And this is something that may be selected for, particularly if bacterial cells can be grouped together into clonally related volumes, closely related groups of cells occupying the same volume, so that the death of the phage in association with the death of one cell nonetheless allows for the other cells in that environment to live and thrive, which is advantageous if those cells have the same genotype as the cell that sacrificed itself. And then also there is an ability to be closer to the light, for example, by photosynthetic organisms, and also this business of avoiding shading that we talked about also in the course of, in terms of the ability to acquire nutrients via absorption, as you see in biofilms and also sponges and things like that. By being bigger, you can thrust yourself out there and gather up these resources, and at the same time avoiding being shaded by other organisms.